yesterday in an article titled 11 and 18 in Burn Unit Undocumented. UCSD cases put focus on who pays for care. Reporters Cheryl Clark and Leslie Berenstein emphasized the burden that emergency care for undocumented immigrants imposes on local hospitals and taxpayers. And they gave a pulpit to Mark Krikorian, the spokesman for an anti-immigrant group, who railed against the Mexican government, who he claimed should pay for any injury, quote, to people who are sneaking across the border at the time of injury and clearly don't have any business here. The article, and this was the first separate piece, first time UT had printed more than a paragraph about the people who were died, burned, injured, and arrested in the Harris fire. It was just astonishing, and it was utterly despicable. What are we to believe? Local taxpayers and long-suffering health maintenance organizations are the true victims of the fire? Badly burned Mexicans cost us money? It's not surprising that the right-wing blog sphere immediately was filled with hosannas to the UT, revealing that at last we knew the secret of unaffordable health care in the United States. In fact, what this kind of article exposes is the real meaning of the stolid middle-class values that the UT has been celebrating for the last 10 days. And every Republican from the president on down to the Republican dog catcher has been celebrating with big smiles, turning this whole tragedy into a campaign rally. But the real values are the bigotry, the selfishness, and the manipulated rage that glue together Republican ideology from Rancho Santa Fe to the White House. If there was ever a time for San Diego progressives to unite and fight against the Copley monopoly, and of course KPBS is virtually a non-profit division of the Union Tribune. You can hear Bob Kittle giving us what we should believe is even more frequently in KPBS than the editorial pages of the Union Tribune. To fight against the Copley monopoly, against the corrupt Republican establishment that pins medals on itself for its supposed leadership in allowing almost 4,000 homes to burn in the last 4 years, and against the invisible government of billionaire developers whose greed puts us all in harm's way. I mean, the time to do that is now. The pain of the 1,100 or so families who lost homes, but with only 2 exceptions, did not lose lives, and the largely affluent suburbs affected by the Witch Creek fire should not be used as an excuse to blot out the deeper tragedy of the Harris fire or obscure the trampling of human rights by federal and local officials. It is intolerable to think that the only monument to the Harris victims will be that sinister little sign on the top of Otay Mountain. Thank you.
I don't know about you, but when this whole tragedy started, when I turned on the TV and I saw George Bush and Arnold Schwarzenegger cheerfully scampering over the smoldering ruins of people's houses, I thought something is truly wrong here. In fact, it inspired me to go try to find out for myself what was really happening, and I spent the week trying to investigate as much as I could firsthand. And what was really happening was that the heavy hand of the new Jim Crow was clearly at work in San Diego during this evacuation, during this whole crisis. I just want to try to point out a few things which I think will help us understand and frame this whole catastrophe. The competing forces at work, the deeper competing forces at work in our society. On the one hand, we're living through the era of neoliberalism, the conscious starving of the public sector, the Social Security net, so that we can redistribute wealth back to the top, where it ultimately will trickle down to us in a much better form. We also see the relocation of society's resources towards the institutions of repression and war. War abroad, a war in Iraq, and the internal refraction of that war here in the United States, the war on immigrants. In fact, it stands in stark contrast. The way that we've spent billions of dollars in the last few years, billions of dollars fighting wars and militarizing our border. In the last 10 years, there's been the doubling of border agents. There's been the dramatic expansion of the internal repressive apparatus in the form of the Department of Homeland Security. And in fact, whenever there's money needed for war or for repression, there's an endless pocket. But when there's money needed for fire prevention, new fire trucks, well, the budgets run dry. We now spend, just as a side note, we now spend more money on what are called national defense projects, which include border militarization. We spend about $58 billion a year, which, if you put that into context of the global military spending, we spend more just on things like border militarization than other countries like Great Britain spend on their whole military. And this became clear in this fire as we have National Guard troops with their guns pointed at Mexicans, now pointing their guns not at the border at Mexicans, but not pointing them, but carrying guns in Qualcomm Stadium. The same people who are supposed to prevent people from coming in are now supposed to protect them. We see this characterization, this divide taking place in terms of San Diego. For low-income workers out in East County, of all ethnicities, for Native Americans on reservations who are unexplainably left behind and forced to save each other, the Native American tribes, and of course what amounts to millions of undocumented peoples who live in the shadows from Los Angeles to the Mexican border. I want to point out a few things that were identified. Mike pointed out some of the more egregious aspects of how immigrant workers were persecuted during this, but I want to point out a few more. What the media left out. Aside from the family that was divided and deported from Qualcomm Stadium, what happened almost immediately after that was all evacuation centers implemented requirement for IDs in order to receive food aid. Not only that, but law enforcement, different types of law enforcement, essentially colonized these evacuation centers. And after in essence, to enforce the idea of IDs being checked before people can receive their aid. And so, beginning with the process of the family being deported, two things happened. We have the militarization of evacuation, and we have, spreading almost as fast as the fires, the fear amongst these communities of people who hear about these things and feel lost, feel helpless. Families after this event were ejected from Qualcomm and other evacuation centers. And sometimes, in some cases, they were rousted in the middle of the night while they were sleeping, asked if they had ID, and if they didn't, they were escorted out. Others were kept from coming in. Others in Qualcomm actually went and hid in their cars. Right? They didn't leave their cars. They slept in their cars in the parking lot for fear that if they stayed in the stadium, they might be identified. And if for those of us who went to Qualcomm to actually try to document this, one thing that stood out in our minds is how people were treated like less than human if they didn't speak English. There was virtually no resources set aside for people who spoke Spanish or other languages. And they were shuttled about, often told that there was nothing available for them. These are documented cases. This stands in sharp contrast to something that I was quite impressed with, and something that didn't make it into the UT, surprisingly enough, which is the way the Latino community pulled together during this time of crisis. How many people here heard about or donated or participated in the relief efforts at Chicano Park? Okay, so to me, these are the people who should be celebrated as the real heroes of this event.